Sign on. Welcome to today's episode of Mastering the Unknown, a place for insights, tools, and different perspectives on how to deal with uncertainty. And here with me today is Brian Robertson, who developed Holacracy, former programmer, gone entrepreneur, did a lot of trial and error to come up with this revolutionary framework on running a self-managed organization. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Melanie.
Oh, it's beautiful. I was so curious to bring you on to get another perspective. And especially when we're in times where hierarchical structures are trying to organize themselves and get clarity. Could you maybe give a little context about what Holacracy is all about and how it works?
Yeah, it's a different way of organizing a company than what we're used to, management hierarchy. It's a framework, really, and I'd put it in the same category as a management hierarchy, right? Management hierarchy doesn't tell you specifically how to organize your business. It's just a framework, right? Let's centralize power in a CEO, and they'll break it down a hierarchy of managers and so on. Holacracy is a different framework that does not use a command hierarchy in order to clarify who does what. It's still highly structured. You still have rules. You still have responsibilities. It gets you the same results that management hierarchy does. It just uses a different set of mechanisms to break down the work. And it's used by about 1,000 companies now all over the world. And they're in the broader category of self-managing organizations. In other words, ones that invite everybody to do the work we typically think of managers as doing.
So what actually got you personally on this whole path of exploring, and you were talking about experimenting and the lab work when you got started?
Yeah, so I was a new entrepreneur when about 20 years ago, was starting a software company. And I kind of started that company with just a sense that there's got to be a better way to run a company. I had been part of larger bureaucratic management hierarchies and found it was always so difficult to drive change. And I mean, it felt like the system was almost designed to resist change instead of designed to actually like work with it and adapt. And I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I just had this drive. There's got to be a better way. And I thought I wanted to start my own company as a laboratory. And so I did. I started building my software company, but the whole purpose was let's experiment in different ways to run a company. And so I did. I tried every idea, technique, process, anything you could think of, and then started pioneering and creating our own until we found something that seemed to actually work in practice.
So really, sorry, what was that?
Oh, Holacracy was the result of many years of experimenting.
So I'm just curious, what was the process, without knowing that you'll end up at Holacracy, the process of deriving what works and what not? That sounds like it needs a process as well.
Yeah, it totally does. Maybe let me share a story that kind of inspired or motivated the process and gave us the key question we were orienting around. So at the same time I'm starting this company, I'm also learning to fly airplanes. I was a private pilot, student pilot at the time. And it was a hobby, it was fun. But as I was learning to fly, I had a very scary experience. I was up in the airplane alone for the first time, flying away from my home airport. So I had no instructor with me. I only had about 20 hours of flight time at this point. So I'm pretty novice. And along my journey, the low voltage light comes on my instrument panel. And they don't teach you much about the airplane hardware, right? So I barely knew how to fly the thing. I didn't know what that meant. But my instinct was check the other instruments, right? So one by one, I looked at every instrument on that dashboard, right? And one by one, every other instrument says there's nothing wrong, nothing anomalous, everything's fine, right? My altimeter's fine. I'm not losing altitude. I'm not losing airspeed. I'm on course. Navigation's fine. Everything's fine. And so I decided this must not be that big of a deal. I'm just going to ignore it. Only one instrument is reporting anything wrong. And, so probably not a big deal. I ignored it. I just kept flying. Turns out that was a really bad decision. It turns out that one instrument was sensing something that none of the other instruments were tuned into. And I nearly crashed the plane that day. It was really bad. And fortunately, I did make it down barely. And after violating international airspace, it was really bad. um, and I'm reflecting on this, and I realize this is what happens in companies, right? It's we humans become the instruments. We are the sensors for our company. We sense reality on its behalf. But we tune into different things, right? We have different roles, different backgrounds, different strengths. We naturally tune into different information. And often, when one lone person senses something that no one else does, it's nearly impossible to drive change. Um, and so I just watched this, like what gets in the way? And I found it was actually worse than that. Even when lots of people sense the need, often change is incredibly difficult, let alone when smaller and smaller groups, or when one person senses it and their boss is too busy and too overloaded to actually see the need. Right? Good luck driving change. And so the question that became the focus for the experimenting was, how can I build a system where anyone who senses anything anywhere in the organization can drive meaningful change? And I started paying attention to what gets in the way, right? The one thing that gets in the way is somebody just doesn't have clarity that they have the authority themselves to go do something, right? So you have people getting permission all the time. We're trying to call a big meeting and get consensus and buy-in, right? So, okay, how can we create an empowering system where people know the freedom they have to go lead, right, and drive change? All right, well, there's got to be some limits on that then, we found. So how do we clarify the limits for what change you can do? And so we just looked at this, everything we can see, what gets in the way. Painful meetings get in the way. How do we solve that? And that question drove the experimentation. How can we enable people to drive change, but in a way that doesn't cause harm somewhere else in the system? And that's the hard part, right? If everyone can drive change, you can easily end up with chaos. And it's not enough to just be able to change anything. You need to keep the rest of the system safe. So that became the experimentation, the iteration. And eventually that started developing concrete processes, right? So when I tell people Holacracy uses no management hierarchy, they often get the wrong idea that it's just, unstructured chaos. And it's not. It's a highly structured system. Companies running with Holacracy have more structure than management hierarchy, not less. They just get to the structure differently, and the structure is much more adaptable, right? And that's because this experimentation led to lots of tangible processes for driving change. So there are lots of really clear ways to do it. It's not just chaos. It's not just anyone does anything. It's structured freedom. It's freedom within limits, and all of that gets clarified.
So I'm wondering, there's a part of it moving away from ego more to a role. Yeah. And there seems to be in hierarchies, people worked really hard to get to certain positions. Yeah. And I'm kind of wondering how a larger corporation who has that in place and wants to transition, wants to be more agile and wants to be more innovative, how's that possible?
Yeah, changing any system is hard. Right, of course. I mean, it's easy if you're a total startup to start with some new framework, but of course, that's not the reality. Most companies today have been doing something for a while. And so what we find is it's not an instant change, it's a gradual change. But what happens right away, there's a commitment to adopt some new processes and some new habits. And then there's a time frame of learning, of getting into the new habits. When we help coach a company through this, we focus on one habit at a time, right? And we've kind of boiled it down to, well, first, what are the rules of the game? There's a new rule book. There's a new set of rules of the game for how power works and who can drive change, who can make which decisions. But just having new rules isn't enough. People need to be in the habit of using the new rules, using the processes. And there's too much to learn all at once. So it's just one habit at a time, and those habits are often really small, and we focus on helping the company practice them for a couple of weeks and learn about them, and then add a new habit and another habit and another habit. And so the change is more gradual than I think most people realize it's going to be. But before you know it, when you do that kind of behavioral habit change, you can change a lot over a long time, right? And it often starts in part of the company, especially in a larger company. We have very large organizations that are doing this right now, just at a department or two or three, right? Because it's too much to bite off all at once. So often it's one remarkable leader from some department somewhere says, you know what, I have a vision that things could be different, and I'm willing to take a risk and try something new. And then they use Holacracy as the tool for that, and they roll it out in their team or their department. And we've seen cases where that department, then the kind of nearby departments that work with them will it'll spread like a virus. Apt analogy for present times, right? And it kind of spreads that way.
Oh, absolutely. So you were saying, anyone can drive change, but there is a self-regulation in that. Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah. So, one of the instincts I think a lot of leaders get when they realize they want something more adaptable is they look at all the things that limit, right? They see all the bureaucracy, all the policies, right? They see people kind of constantly getting permission instead of just acting empowered. And the first instinct is often, let's just throw out the things that are in the way. Let's throw out the policies, the bureaucracy, the whatever, and just, but that doesn't actually do it, right? If you go to your team tomorrow and you say, good news, everyone, you're empowered, not much changes, right? I mean, you don't end up with a lot of empowered people. You end up with a confused team, right? Because people know there's got to be some limit to that, right? There's really something they shouldn't do. And if they don't know what they shouldn't do, then they don't really know the freedom they have to act when you don't know the limits. So if you want to give people real power and real freedom, you need to focus as much on clarifying the limits of the power. And that's the counterintuitive thing I learned in this journey. So you need to know, what are the boundaries? What can't you do, right? Because if you don't know your limits, you don't know your freedom. And so with Holacracy, there's a process, and it's as much for clarifying the limits, the constraints, the rules, right? Because within which the stance Holacracy takes is, when you have a role, right? It's a role-based system, so there's lots of roles, and it's not just like a job description. I fill 20 roles in 6 different teams in my company. When I'm filling one of my roles, I have the complete freedom and the complete power to take any action or make any decision anywhere in the company to get my role's purpose met. Every role has a purpose. It has some expectations on it. To do my job, I can do anything as long as there's no rule against it. So with that stance of, we start with a default of, you have freedom to do anything unless there's a rule against it. Now, the important thing becomes, let's clarify the rules, because we really don't want anyone doing anything, right? We do want some rules. We want some constraints. So then we start focusing on learning what those are. And one of the things I learned in that process was, you can't get that right up front, right? You can't figure out what are all the constraints we want in our organization, or you overdo it. And that's where a lot of management hierarchies are today. They have policies for everything to try to control everything. And you need the minimally sufficient. And that means you need to learn as you go, what constraints do we really need? And let's learn. So you need a process to add them, instead of trying to start with a bunch or having to run them all up a management hierarchy to have, someone at the top start defining new policies. What you really need is anyone on a team being able to say, I'm running into an obstacle getting my work done, and I need some constraint for others to honor, or I need some new expectation on somebody else, right? So we had a governance process to define that, and every team does this. So everyone on every team is regularly going through this governance process where they can propose any new constraint or any new expectation on anyone else on the team, right? And that lets us learn together. So we can start with a really lightweight structure that gives people lots of freedom, and then stuff happens, things get in the way. But instead of just accepting that or overly limiting people to start with, we learn from it, right? And we start identifying the constraints we really need and the expectations we really need, right? And then within that, we empower people. We say, here's your expectations, here's your constraints, lead your role. Go be like a CEO of your role. Oh, I can't hear you. You're cutting out audio. That's strange. Huh. No, I'm not hearing anything. Are you hearing me okay?
Okay, I think
Oh,
I
there
should
you
be
are.
back now.
You're back. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. And how can we build this in of, not the voice not being heard?
Right.
So I'm curious about, there are different leadership styles. What would you say is really vital for the individual who is taking on roles and leadership and working in this, what is it that they should be coming from?
The most important capacity I find is, I'll call it maturity. And what I mean by that is it's not about like a type preference. Like there's different types or different styles, right? Some people are more behind the scenes, some are more like forcefully outgoing, and some people prefer, kind of chaos and dwelling in that. Some people prefer high structure. All of that works with this. What matters is more openness to learning new things, to different styles. That's why I call it maturity as opposed to a type thing, right? It's does somebody have the ability to look at what they don't know, to look at their biases, to look at the kinds of things that maybe they're accepting as fact that are really some assumptions built in, or does somebody have the willingness and flexibility and strength of self to say, I'm going to go back to being a beginner in some ways, because whenever you're changing a paradigm, you have to go back to being a beginner, and you have to take a beginner's mind and start learning again. And that seems to be the capacity that's most needed to adapt to this. If people are stuck in their old ways of leading, whatever those ways are, whatever the style is, it's not going to work. There is no style today that is just perfectly suited for this. It's broadening in so many ways what we have to bring as leaders anywhere in the company. And so the most important thing is this just ability to grow, to adapt.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is just an open learning system, curiosity,
Yep.
and willingness to explore.
Absolutely.
Now we're in very special times, and a lot of companies have pivoted to remote work.
Mm-hmm.
You've, with HolacracyOne, have had remote business partners, and I'm just curious, how do you keep a company culture when there's no face-to-face meetings?
Yeah. I think so for me, the first thing comes to whether or not you have face-to-face meetings. If you want a really healthy culture, you need safety. I think that goes, the need is just greater. What I think remote does is it doesn't create really, in my view, any new needs. What it does is amplify everything, right? Like if you have, if you don't have the healthiest culture or the most safety, at least face-to-face kind of lessens the impact of it. When you remove face-to-face, it goes up, right? Or if you don't have clarity of who does what and who makes which decisions, you can often use walking around the office to at least stay informed and listen in. But when you don't have that ability, the need for clarity goes up. We need these things anyway. Any business benefits from safety, from clarity. But when it's remote, it goes from just something you can work around to good luck if you don't have it. And when it comes to safety in particular, I find there's a need for knowing how power works when people are kind of tiptoeing around trying to guess what's in the boss's head and please the boss, which is what a lot of management hierarchies people do, right? We all know the boss has some criteria. It's often not completely clear. So we spend a lot of time playing please the boss. And that's kind of scary, or keep everyone around us happy, look good. And when you have like a really clear set of rules of the game, you know what's expected. It's all clear. And that's one of the side effects of Holacracy. You get real clarity of everything expected of you. What are the rules of the game? What freedom do you have? You don't need to guess anymore. You can just lead your piece of it. And for me, that creates a tremendous amount of safety. I know I'm free to lead, and I know when it's my turn to follow because it's somebody else's area that they're leading in. And that means I'm free to kind of just be myself. And I think that also goes with safety is just the freedom to be authentic, to show up. And yeah, I so often see when people want to do cultural work, they don't look at power structure of their company, right? Most people accept management hierarchy as the only way. Most entrepreneurs even I speak to aren't even aware that there are other frameworks out there. The awareness is growing. It's spreading a lot in the past decade, but it's still pretty new. And so people don't question power structure, but the power structure we're in fundamentally limits what's possible in the culture, right? It's kind of like if imagine we lived in a medieval feudal society where the local baron could do whatever they want. what kind of safety is possible in that kind of system where the local baron is literally, owns us effectively? There's a limit on how safe that culture can possibly be because of the power structure around us. Versus if we live in a modern free society, we can have much safer relationships with each other and with the local authorities or whatever, because there's some constraints and due process and rule of law, and these things created a different culture or enabled a different culture. And I think the same is true in organizations. If we want to do deep work on culture, we have to go to what's below culture, which is power structure, right? There's a famous quote by Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for lunch, right? And he's pointing to how culture is more fundamental than strategy, right? If you have the wrong culture, you can kill your strategy. And if you have the right culture, new strategies are possible. And I love that quote. I think it's spot on. And I'd add to it my own part, which is, yes, culture eats strategy for lunch, and structure eats culture for dinner. And what I mean by that is that fundamental underlying power structure of who can make which decision and how do we change that? How do we set expectations on each other, right? That fundamental power structure stuff is kind of lower level than culture. It's not to say it's more important, it's just more foundational, right? And if you want to have a really healthy culture, at some point you've got to do work at that level. And that's what I found. My whole journey here, I didn't start looking at power structure at all. I started looking at culture, right? I started trying to do all the work I wanted to empower people to drive change at the cultural level. And I found a limit to it. And that's when I started getting into the underlying power structure and expectation structure of the company.
So while you're saying this, I'm curious if there is, someone out there that wants to transition, and it's not someone who's, in the power structure. Is there an opportunity to introduce this? Or...
Yeah, if you're not somewhere in that management hierarchy, it's really hard, right? Because that's what you're changing, the power structure around you. And if you don't have a place in that power structure right now to do that change, it gets really difficult. But I do get that question often from those people. And one of the things I try to advise is find somebody in the power structure who is open to new ideas. And you don't have to sell that person on change everything, right? Just get some openness to explore. Right. So we do a lot of, one of the ways we help companies explore is a little 2-day workshop with a team where we walk the team through completely new ways of structuring and making decisions. Right. And it's a chance to try it on, and it's for their real issues. So at the end of those 2 days, they're done. They can go back to their old power structure, and at least they had a productive kind of retreat where they got to work on some real stuff. Or ideally, they realize that new way of working is really useful. Let's continue doing that even after this. And so if you're that person that doesn't really have the power to make the decision to do this, you need to find someone in the power structure, and don't try to sell them on changing everything. You'll get resistance. Instead, see if they're open to trying something. Maybe get them to go to a training or read a book, or have one of our Holacracy coaches come in and do a little workshop or something. There's lots of ways to explore it, and just get them curious enough to take a dive, to try something like that. And that curiosity, if you follow it, often leads to more curiosity and to more questions, and eventually some answers and some vision of there is something else possible, and maybe it's better.
So that also leaves me with the curiosity of, you've got a company and they did the 2-day workshop and they're excited and they got to experience something. Now they're a little department in a larger corporation, and they go back, and there's also something about the environment you're in, right? How can you transition from that and keep that positive virus from spreading?
Yeah, we had one story of that in a government agency. So one department in a large government adopted Holacracy. And you can imagine the kind of old-fashioned environment that they were in. All the stereotypes of government agency really fit. And so one of the things they did was they kind of created almost a translation layer, because they have regulations and laws they need to align with in the broader structure. Like at one point, there was a rule that you had to have a certain status level in the management hierarchy to sign a contract, right? Or make certain key decisions. And so they created a role filled by the one person that had that status level in the department. And the role was called Pencil Whip. And its entire job was sign off on whatever contract is presented to him, as long as it's done through the due authority of the whole Holacracy process. And that's what he did. He would just sign things so it had the right name on it, right? And so they kind of translated in and out. Or when, you know, the broader company needed certain job descriptions, and Holacracy kind of doesn't use job descriptions. It uses a very different way of describing work. But they created a translation where when they needed that, they could kind of copy and paste something from what Holacracy did and present the rest of the organization with what they needed for their processes. And it can work remarkably well if you can set up that translation layer right. And it can also be challenging. We had another team at Google that they really suffered because there were broader HR policies that they didn't have the freedom to ignore. And it created this like internal competitive environment that really got in the way of the more open collaborative culture that Holacracy tends to create. And so that was hard, and they did their best with the constraint. It was still better than nothing, and it was an obstacle, right?
Mhm.
So there's different strategies to it. The most important thing is just experiment. You don't have to get the right answer. You don't have to have all the answers. The whole point of Holacracy is not having all the answers up front. It's giving you a process to experiment and innovate and adapt. So you start with bad answers, and sometimes those lead you to better answers. You know, if you look at some of my company's processes, I really love some of our processes, but we didn't start with them perfect. We started with kind of half-baked, not great processes. and we tried them and we learned and we kept improving and iterating. And that's the point of Holacracy. It's not about having all the right stuff up front. It's about giving you the meta process to allow you to change any other process in the organization. Right? So all of these things are like, start where you are and learn as you go.
Where are the instances where you reflect, or is that already built into the system? Because without reflection, you'll just continue doing things, right?
Yeah. So we had the governance process I mentioned earlier. Every team does this, and it's maybe once a month or twice a month when a team is newer to it. And in this meeting, you can also do it asynchronously once the team's a little more advanced. But in the beginning, it's in a meeting. And everyone on the team, anyone filling a role in the team, is invited to participate. And one of the key framing questions there is we ask people to reflect on the tensions they felt. And we define tension as just the feeling you get when there's a gap between where you are and some potential you sense. Things could be better in some way, right? So you could call that a problem, but it's also an opportunity. It's, forget about the labels. It's just that feeling of there's a gap. We are here and we could be there. And with those tensions, that drives the governance process. So instead of the reflection being kind of ungrounded theory and idea land, that keeps it really grounded. What's in the way of your work over the past 2 weeks, right? What are you doing that you feel like could be better, could be more efficient, more effective, serve the customer better, whatever, right? What are you sensing that could be better? And then make a proposal. It doesn't have to be a good proposal, it's just anything that might help with that. And then there's a process to kind of sort through that, make sure it's not going to cause harm somewhere else in the team. And from there, we end up with a tangible change at the end of that process, right? And so it's not just reflecting. Some teams do really good retrospectives. They reflect in some way, but they're not as good at driving that to what's going to be tangibly different going forward. And what I love about this governance process is it starts with the real grounded tensions, reflecting on them, but then it goes through a process of getting to concretely, what are we expecting differently from which roles going forward, or what process are we changing as a result of this, right? And that drives the changes to the power structure, to the processes of the organization. And it's in that process, it's not at all about status, it's not about egos. I give an example of how it works in a real story. I love this story. As from my organization many years ago, I do a lot of public speaking and conferences and things like that. And so we get a lot of invitations to go to conferences, and I fill a spokesperson role that goes and does the speaking. And I work with another person that fills our casting agent role. And the casting agent gets the invites and has to basically negotiate with the conference organizer, figure out which conference to send me to. And the process way long ago was she would talk to the conference organizer, she'd negotiate something, build a plan, and then at the end of her process, she'd present it to me. And sometimes I'd say, no, I'm not going to go to that. It's not worth my time, right? Wrong market, or it's not big enough, or whatever. And, she felt so disempowered, right? She built a relationship with the conference organizer. She spent all this time coming up with a plan, and then I shoot it down at the end. And so she shows up in our governance meeting. We're reflecting on tensions, and she's like, hey, this just happened again. This is now regular. I have tension. And she made a proposal to add an expectation onto the spokesperson role, which was something like documenting the criteria I use to decide what I accept or reject. She said, because if I saw that criteria, right, she said, I could figure it out in advance before I spend all this time negotiating and building a relationship. Does this fit, right? So she wanted to expect that from my spokesperson role. And we took that through our decision-making process we have in this meeting, and we check in with others. Does anyone see any reasons this is going to cause harm in your ability to do your work? And no one did. So about 2 minutes after that proposal was made, we had a new expectation added onto my role, and she was able to turn to me and say, so when do you think you're going to have that done for me, right? Give me an estimate. When are you going to have a draft of that for me? Now, the interesting thing, the footnote here that I just love about this story, I'm the founder of the company and a seasoned business leader and CEO from many years past, and she was our newest hire right out of college, right? And in what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 2 minutes can add an expectation onto the founder and then turn to him and say, so when will you have that done for me by, right? I find that so remarkable. And it's because that isn't about the egos and the status, and you don't have to play the politics. It's just about her role has a job to do and a purpose, and so does mine. And she has the freedom and power to lead her role and drive change to serve it. And so do I. And her role needed something from mine. And we added that expectation, we got clear, and we moved forward. And that kind of learning process improves all of your other processes. That's what I mean by a meta process. You can change any process, any expectation, any policy, right? And you learn. And so the process gets more and more efficient and better. And when there's big shocks in the world, which I think every company is pretty familiar with right now, this is when you most need it. You've got to be able to iterate fast. You've got to first empower people, because if people can't go drive change and take action, you're not doing enough experiments to actually get the data of what needs to change. And then that's not enough. You then need to actually learn from the experiments and drive changes to everything in the business. So to me, like, I look at the businesses running with Holacracy now and how they've adapted to this. And it is, I've heard so many of them now tell me, thank God we had Holacracy in place before this, because it allowed us to actually change our entire business. And many of them had to, like, massive changes to their revenue streams, and that's what Holacracy ultimately facilitates. It's responding to change.
Wow, Brian, I think that's a full stop and an exclamation mark for sure. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective on this. Exciting to really hear an example how that is implemented, and especially, with every single person having a purposeful way of interacting regardless, and interacting with the roles. And we'll add a little surprise with a link down below. So thank you for being here and showing how the unknown can be mastered in iterative processes. Don't have to get it perfect, but stay curious, stay open, and provide a safe environment for learning.
Cool. Thanks for digging in and asking all these great questions. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, Melanie.
Great. Okay. Bye.
Bye.